All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this Lunch and Learn. I'm Natalie Belanger. I'm the Public Programs Manager at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History. Many of you who are frequent attendees of Lunch and Learn are used to seeing my colleague Jen Busa. She can't be here today. I promise I will try my best to be an effective Jen, although that is not easy. Those are very big shoes that I need to fill. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen for our presentation today and just jump right in and introduce our speaker. Just a note, if you have questions as we go through the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat. And at the end, we will have some time for questions as well. So today I am very pleased to welcome Irving Moy, a first generation Chinese American born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, where his parents owned and operated a Chinese hand laundry. He is the first in his family to graduate from high school and college. Irving retired as a manager with the Connecticut Department of Public Health and Healthcare Regulation. His passion is his reading and study of U.S. history, especially of Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War era. In July 2008, Governor Jodi Rell appointed him to serve as one of 15 members of the Connecticut Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He portrays Corporal Joseph Pierce, a Chinese, who enlisted in Company F, 14th Regiment, Connecticut Volunteer Infantry, and fought in the Civil War at reenactments and living history events. He is the author of An American Journey, My Father, Lincoln, Joseph Pierce, and Me, published in 2009, the bicentennial year of Lincoln's birth. Irving, welcome.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for your introduction. And I want to thank everyone for the pleasure of your time for the next hour. Next slide, please. May being Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month is the topic of my presentation today. And below my name are some of the areas that I'm going to try to cover during this presentation. Next slide. And, thank you again, Natalie, for the introduction, but here's a photo montage of the different roles that I play. Joseph Pierce is the Chinese soldier at the bottom of the right. Me in uniform at Pierce's gravesite in Meriden, Connecticut at Walnut Grove Cemetery. And this was a photo long ago when I started my career with the Department of Public Health. Next slide. Many credit the observance of this month to a congressional aide by the name of Jenny Ju, who worked for Representative Frank Horton. And during the Bicentennial, 1976, Jenny felt that, it was important that Asian Americans also be recognized for their contributions to the history of this country. At the time, Blacks and Hispanics had months that would recognize their contributions. And she thought that at this point, there were Asians that also, even though they never received credit, that they should. And she approached Representative Horton to see if something could be done. So as you know, in Congress, you have to go through both houses, the House and the Senate. And finally, in June 1977, a joint resolution was passed and signed by President Carter on October 5th of 1978. And it was called Asian Pacific Heritage Month. And not month, but it was only celebrated for the first 10 days in May. And the reasons why it was celebrated in May was that two events happened in that particular month. In 1845, the very first Japanese immigrants came to the United States. And then May 10th in 1869, we completed the transcontinental railroad. Unfortunately, when the final golden spike was struck, that picture that we're all familiar with, none of the Chinese who contributed greatly to building that railroad was included in that picture. And then in 2009, President Obama declared that American Pacific Islander Heritage month would be a month that, again, we would recognize the contributions of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I firmly believe that the ones that we are recognizing are the ones that came after 1965. That was when President Johnson signed the 1965 Nationalization Immigration Act, which allowed Chinese and Pacific Islanders and people of Asian descent to enter the United States in the same percentages as other countries and all. But that the particular generations of Chinese that preceded that, beginning with the ones that came to in 1848 to mine the gold fields, they were all forgotten. It's the Chinese that your grandparents, that your parents, that you remember growing up and living with, who ran laundries and restaurants, that really are the forgotten generation of Chinese. And what I would like to do is share my father's story, just to give you an idea of what these people had to overcome to really find a place here in this country to better their lives and all. Next slide, Natalie. I'd like to give sort of a brief history of the Chinese exclusion acts that were enacted against, in particular, the Chinese, because the 1882 Act didn't just happen by itself. When the Chinese first came to the United States, again in 1840, 48, and so to mine the gold fields, California passed two restrictions against the Chinese. One of them was the Foreign Miners Act, which meant that they had to pay a fee in order to mine any of the fields out there for gold. And what they were given were already areas that were already mined. If you were white, you did not have to pay a fee. Also, during that particular year, when the Chinese came to California, they passed the Anti-Miscegenation Act statute, which said that Chinese could not marry any whites. In 1854, after a Chinese man testified in court, which resulted in the guilty verdict of a white man, the courts decided to change the laws where the Chinese could not testify against whites in courts. And what that really meant also is the fact that if the Chinese received any crimes against them by anyone who was white, they couldn't really even testify against them. After the railroads were built and the Chinese, settled in California and all, the only work they could really find was in restaurants and laundries. And I always wondered, why was that the case? And in this book by Stephen Sears, he talks about, the building of the transcontinental railroads. And he said the Chinese were equated to another group of people who were discriminated against. And that group was women. And whites compared Chinese men to women because they were short in stature, they had long hair, the cues, they had fine complexions and all. And what did women do back then? They just did laundry and they cooked. And that was the stereotype that the Chinese, unfortunately, had to live with if they were going to find any work in this country and all. In 1870, the city of San Francisco, they passed something called the Cubic Air Ordinance. And what that was is that the Chinese, since they had no other place to stay, if they opened up a laundry, they lived in the laundry. So what they tried to do is decrease the size of the businesses. So that forced the Chinese not to even be able to live in the businesses that they owned and all. And then in 1870, this was really the first act that they tried to pass, a federal act, to restrict the Chinese laborers, and whom they called immortal women, where the Chinese women had to prove that they never or would never be prostitutes and all. And then finally, there was another indignation against the Chinese in 1876, when the state of California, if you happened to break a law and you were arrested being a Chinaman, you had to cut the queue off the back of your head. And that was really a way of, a degrading punishment to the Chinese and all. And then in 1882, 1880s and all, there was a political movement. Basically, the Chinese had to go because they were saying that the Chinese were taking away jobs from Americans. I think that we can always use that statement, blank or taking away jobs from Americans, but they were really jobs that people didn't want to do. And because of the political outcry and all, the representatives, those in the West who never really met anyone who was black, and those in the East who never met anyone who was Chinese, they banded together and they supported, the Chinese Excluding Act to vote that in. And also in return, they ended Reconstruction after the Civil War. And that really opened up an era where there was a lot of violence against the Chinese and also blacks, the Ku Klux Klan. It was also the time when there was the final solution of moving Native American Indians to the reservations and taking their children and putting them in boarding schools to try to get rid of their heritage and all. Jen, could you go to the next slide? And the main outcome was this Chinese Exclusion Act, the only act that was ever enacted against a particular race. And basically, they said that Chinese laborers couldn't come to this country. If you're Chinese, you were prohibited from being a U.S. citizen. If you're here in the country, you weren't allowed to bring your own family members into the country. And basically, by doing that, what they were trying to do was basically force the Chinese that were here to leave the country, to go back to China, or if they stayed, there was no way the population would ever grow. And that being said, that the Chinese that were here would basically die out, and there'd be no Chinese here in this country at all. This act really lasted until December of 1943, when China became an ally of the United States against Germany, Italy, and Japan. After that, every 10 years, the act was basically extended. And the next act that came in was the Garrity Act in 1892, which basically said that if you're Chinese, you had to register with the government, and then you were issued a little card, which basically was like an internal passport that you had to show if any official asked you for that. In fact, the Chinese soldier, Joseph Pierce, said, "I betray." He was a resident of Meriden, Connecticut, fought in the Civil War. He was the highest ranked Chinese soldier, fought from Gettysburg all the way to Appomattox, and he became a naturalized citizen even before this act came into being. But because he was Chinese, he was told that he needed to register, and all, which he did. In the 1880 census, he recorded that he was from China. In 1890, the census, unfortunately, all the records were destroyed in the fire. And the very next census that he was listed in, the 1900, he listed that he was from Japan. And at that point, he had even cut off the queue that he had. So again, these restrictions, these acts kept following along. And finally, the one that I think we're all aware of is really during World War II, between 1942 and 1946. The Japanese were basically internment camps because there was a fear that the Japanese would be, the hidden enemy in this country. But probably the most decorated unit in World War II is the Japanese group that fought for this country. They won more accolades, and more members of that particular unit died. So we really can't really brand people just the way they look and all. Next slide, please. But, the one thing that really, in a way, which unfortunately happened, what was fortunate for the Chinese, was that the 1906 San Francisco earthquake occurred. And why I say that is that all the records of the Chinese who came to this country, when they came in, they were basically interrogated. All the information that they gave, where they were from, relatives, family members, descriptions of the villages, and were kept in government offices in San Francisco. Well, when that earthquake happened, basically the whole downtown area and all the government buildings were really destroyed. And all those records were destroyed and disappeared, which gave the Chinese laborers that were in this country the opportunity to say that they were actually citizens. They were children of Chinese who were, born in this country or received legal status and all. And the immigration officials really had no records to really know if what they said was true or not. And this really led to, the rise of immigration brokers who basically match paper fathers in the United States with paper sons in China, with false documents and family histories and all. So I'd like to, share my father's story, because my father was a paper son. This allowed the Chinese, who became a paper son, to assume the identity of say, a son, or even a daughter in those rare occasions of a Chinese who was here. And this allowed them to really enter the country, even though it was illegal. Next slide, please. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step by Confucius. And this one man's immigration story is the story of my father. Next slide. This slide here is a picture of my father in the center, my two uncles, my Uncle Nock on the left, and my Uncle Harry on the right. And my father was 16 or 17 at the time during this, in the photograph and all. And all the sons knew that their father one day, once they reached a certain age, they would be called to join him in the United States. In this case, to work in the laundry in Brooklyn, so they could earn money to send back home to the family and all. So my father received word, and he received papers, and he was to assume the identity of a Ming Zhou. And what he had to do is really memorize all the information about this one particular person, so that when he did enter the country, when they interrogated him, he would be able to answer all the questions they might have and be able to enter the country. And Natalie, could you show on that little map where Cantong is? Cantong is sort of just below the province there, Guangdong. And if you go further down, you can see where Hong Kong is. And in late January of 1937, my father left his village under the name of Ming Zhou to go to Hong Kong to board a ship. Next slide. He basically, arrived in Hong Kong, and the descriptions that you see on the left-hand side describe what my father had to say. The information that you see here are really from the ship's records that each of the passengers had to give when they were interviewed and all. And the areas that I know that were false was when he gave the name of his mother, the village he was from, his birth date and name. And also the fact that a brother by name of Mbing Chi, who lived on Mott Street in New York, paid for his ticket. Again, those were areas where he had to assume a false identity. So he had to give that information to them. And he boarded an English ship, actually, Royal Majesty ship, the Empress of China. And there's a picture of it. And I just wanted to briefly say that if you have a subscription to Ancestry.com, and also if you look up the website Ellis Island Foundation, you can do a passenger search for any relatives that you might have that that entered through Ellis Island. I did not have an Ancestry.com account, but a friend of mine who works in the public library told me that all the libraries have an account. So there's good sources for you to be able to look up information for yourself. Next slide. And here's the ship's manifest. That information on the top is the questions that the passengers had to answer. And what I highlighted in yellow is the line for Ming Zhou, my father. And what they did on the manifest is they separated all the Chinese from the rest of the passengers. And there was a reason for that. Next slide. And the ship leaving Hong Kong, it took roughly 2.5 weeks to make it to the port of Victoria and Vancouver. And my dad arrived on Valentine's Day in 1937. The 6 passengers, they were turned over to the authorities because Canada at that time also had its own exclusion laws. And they were there and basically questioned before they were allowed to enter into Canada. Next slide. Upon being entered, my dad at that point got on a train on the Canadian National Railroad. And if you could show, Natalie, the route that he took to Nova Scotia. And that photo that's there, the taller building is a hotel, the Nova Scotian Hotel. And that little building there next to it is their train station in Vancouver, Nova Scotia. So it's unknown, basically I had no information what happened the time he arrived in Canada to the time he arrived here. It was basically in a 3.5 week unknown period. I just assumed that he was just being held for questioning and all until he was finally released. Next slide. And here, oh, okay. And here he is. He arrived on March the 16th in 1937. He and 7 other Chinese entered the SS Fort Amherst to take this ship to the United States. And in that photo, you can see the taller building in the center is really the hotel, and to the right of it is the train station. So you can see how close when he got off, to get to the piers and to get on one of the ships that come to the United States. It's unknown when he actually arrived and also what happened again during that whole period or even where he stayed. But we do know he left on March the 16th based on the manifest of the ship. Next slide. And this particular manifest included the Chinese with all the rest of the passengers, but the highlighted block, they grouped the Chinese again. The information that is on the manifest for this particular ship is the same as the one that was on the ship that when he left Hong Kong. And basically the little writing, that one sentence below that basically said that they were ordered to be delivered to the Chinese division on Ellis Island. Next slide. And if you could trace, the passage of the ship down to New York City for me, and that's New York Harbor, which he entered and all. Next slide. Then on March 19th, the 7 Chinese were delivered to Ellis Island at 10 a.m. And the reason it said, the reason why they had to do that, they were held for detention, was due to Chinese exclusion laws. And my father is the 6th name on that list. And what you see in that photo is Ellis Island at the time. Next slide. Now he was detained for questioning to determine if, what he said allowed him to enter the United States. So that's why it was important for him to memorize everything that he could about Ming Zhou, because prior people did leave records of the village supposedly that he came from. So when they asked questions, he even to the mundane point was, where was the church located in the village that you were lived in? You know, he had to be able to answer that. So it took 20 days for him to finally convince them that he could enter the country legally. Now, the photo on your right is Chinatown during that time, Mott Street in New York. And the records show that he was released to meet his brother, who was supposed to take him to live at 26 Mott Street. I looked through the census during that period. I could not find Bing Chi or my father's name on there. So most likely he was met by his father, who took him to live and work at 512 53rd Street in Brooklyn, which is in East Flatbush. And you can see the laundry on the lower portion to the right there. And that's where he, you know, lived and worked and actually learned the laundry business at that point. And he told me that, you know, he had to work long hours and he actually earned 12 cents per shirt and basically was washed, dried, and ironed. And back then he said that he even had to mix starch because people wore starch in their collars and even the nurses in their nursing caps. And so it wasn't an easy work to learn. Next slide. And then when World War II, you know, the United States entered due to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, my father had to report to the local draft board and register. And you can see the information that he put down, where he lived, his height. He was 115 pounds at the time. The birthday that he listed is actually the birthday of Ming Joe and not really his birthday. And he was then discharged to go to Fort Sill in Oklahoma. And basically, you know, he had a grammar school education, at least they thought he did. And then his semi-skilled occupation in civilian life was being a laundryman. Next slide. Here he is in uniform. He was assigned to be trained as an artilleryman, Battery A, 62nd Field Artillery Battalion. And for some unknown reason, he wasn't assigned to active duty. It's actually discharged on February 5th in 1944. Now, after the war, Congress passed an act called the War Brides Act, and this allowed spouses and children of military personnel to really, you know, foreigners who fought for the United States to be able to bring either wives, children to this country. It even extended it where they were able to bring new brides. And my father, with the encouragement of my grandfather, went back to China. Next slide. Where the family, you know, arranged a marriage. Most marriages back then were arranged by family marriage brokers and all. So my dad and mom were married February 3rd, 1947 in the U.S. consulate in Canton, and it was witnessed by the vice consul. There's a picture of my mother and father. My mother, I believe, if I remember correctly, she was 16 at the time, and my father was 26. There's 10 years difference between the two of them. Next slide. Living the American dream. Well, they came back to the United States, and let's see how that turned out. Next slide. After, you know, my mother had to swear whatever to get an affidavit, they were able to book to receive a visa. They booked passage on the SS General Montgomery Meigs. Just aside, my Civil War knowledge, you know, Montgomery Meigs was the Quartermaster General of the Union Army during the Civil War. And if you look at, what my father information he had to give for this particular manifest, it was very little because at that point, he was considered a citizen of the United States. So he basically only had to, answer these few questions in order to get on ship. Next slide, please. They're listed as the first and second passengers on the manifest. And below you can see what my mother had to answer. Basically, it was, again, all that information that my father had to fill out as terms of mother's name, village, whether she could read or write. They found her in good health, no deformities. She was in possession of $50. It was interesting. My father, when he entered the country, only had $10 on hand. And I looked it up, and back then in 1947, $50 was had the buying power of $1,400 in terms of what a dollar was worth. So she had the equivalent of $70,000 with her $50 amount that she carried with her, which was amazing in my eyes, because at this point, a dollar really doesn't buy as much as we hoped it would. Next slide. Well, my parents came back and again settled in Brooklyn, and my mother learned the laundry business at that point. And it's really unknown when my father happened to see an ad that there was a laundry that was for sale in Bridgeport, Connecticut. But on May 1st in 1948, he bought the Wingley Laundry for $3,250. And you can see what that amount of money was worth back then. And the laundry itself was listed in the city directories as early as 1937. And it was interesting. It just seems when you look at Chinese laundries or even businesses, there's always a Wing Li, Wing Hong. And a friend of mine who's done a lot of, research came up with something that said that Wing in Chinese means wealth. And for people, if they opened a business, they always put Wing because they wanted to say wealth for Mr. Li, wealth for Mr. Hong. So it's really a good luck to have Wing in front of your business and all. And that Bridgeport train station became, our means of really travel going back to, Chinatown. I remember growing up when I was a little older, going back every month or every other month to bring back Chinese groceries and all. So that was really our main transportation. And again, it was important for them to find a business and even a home that they could walk to. My father didn't own his first car until 1963, and this was in 1948. So everywhere we went, we had to walk. Next slide. And there's a picture of me in 1948 when I was born. The laundry was located at 105 Congress Street in Bridgeport. I thought it was ironic because when the Chinese Exclusion Act, when they repealed it, they only allowed 105 Chinese to enter this country. So I thought that was amazing that we happened to get a laundry with the same amount of Chinese that they would allow in the country and all. And to the right is a picture of the laundry, and that's my sister, Linda. The laundry itself, we actually lived in a loft. The only bathroom was on the first floor. And I remember growing up, my father would have a bucket with disinfectant for me to use. So I wouldn't have to walk downstairs at night to use. And then when Linda was born in 1956, I think my father finally thought that it was finally time to see if he could find a home for us because it was mighty tight to have 4 people live above the laundry in a loft at the time. He brought his first house in 1956 on High Street, and that again was only 2 blocks away from the laundry. My parents worked 6 days a week with Sundays off. And that Sunday was the time where they spent, time with other Chinese families in the community. And also, Bridgeport was a fun place to grow up with, Seaside Park, Pleasure Beach. We always made it a point, if we could, to be at one of the parks whenever we could. And even though we didn't have much, the block that I lived on, that was centered by Congress Street, Main Street, Gold Street, and Middle Street. The Globe Theater was on there. There was the Middle Street Boys Club. Diagonally across was the Lowe's Pole Line, Majestic. I could remember, seeing a double feature for 25 cents. Bridgeport on Thursdays, it was like being down in Broadway. Stores were open until 9 o'clock. Holland's was open, Reed's, Kresge's. It was just a fun time growing up in Bridgeport, and even going to school there. I went to Washington School, which was up Congress Street down Pequannock. We were let out at 12 o'clock, and I think most of us remember that, to go home to lunch, and we had to be back by 12:45. And God bless my mother, somehow working in that laundry, she always had lunch ready for me to eat. As soon as I finished eating, I ran back up the hill to go to school again. Again, it was just, to me, it was a time that, I have very fond memories of. And I have to say I was very fortunate, because I had two ladies who took an interest in me. To the right, where my sister is the business of the Congress Street vacuum, sewing and vacuum machine. The lady who ran it was a Margaret Gulia, and she became a second mother to me. And my mother didn't speak English at the time, but Margaret enrolled me in school. She took me to doctor's appointments. Anything that, my mother couldn't do, she did for me. She even introduced me to Halloween and Christmas. Even taught me how to roller skate. It was those roller skates where you have the key that you had to put on your shoes and all. And the other lady that really meant a lot to me and helped me was Lois Beach. She was director of Christian education at the Methodist Church in Bridgeport, and she would pick me up on Sundays to go to Sunday school. And I became a Christian through the Methodist Church. Not that my father, who was a Buddhist, ever objected. In fact, my mother was a Christian, and she was because my grandmother, her mother, missionaries converted her to Christianity, but my father never objected to it. So again, I'm just grateful for Lois Beach for doing that. And finally, I'm grateful to my sixth grade teacher, Mary Callery. She took an interest in me and really, really helped me understand the importance of knowing our country's history. I had an interest in it, but she really went out of her way to help me understand that it was important to know the history of the country that you live in. It's important to know how we have the freedoms that we have because of sacrifices that people made before us and all. So that always stuck in my mind. It really, fostered a love of U.S. history for me. Those are some of the artifacts that I donated to the Historical Society or the Connecticut Museum. You have to forgive me, I don't remember the new name, but the next slide, please. The even though the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed, and the fact that we still had the internment of the Japanese and all, there were still attempts to really again control the Chinese in this country. And in 1956, there was a law that was enacted called the Chinese Confession Program, where if you confessed that you came into the country illegally, and then you had to point out other Chinese in the community that did so, you were allowed to become a U.S. citizen. Now, my parents, when my sister and I were growing up, they always said, do not get into any trouble. We don't want anyone looking into our business. We don't want anyone to know that, my father entered this country illegally. He was always afraid that if they found out that they were going to deport all of us back to China and all. Well, when Lyndon Johnson, signed the law, the 1965 Immigration Nationalization Act, all these repressive laws, were out of the books. And because of that, my parents felt that it was possible to really become citizens. And what they did was they, went back to school to learn to take the citizenship tests and all. And I remember helping my mother. One of the questions was, who was Abraham Lincoln? And she would memorize 16th president freed the slaves. And, those are some of the questions that they had to answer, become a U.S. citizen. And when they became a citizen, my father approached me during summer when I came back from when I was 18. He wanted to have his real name, Moy. He asked me to find out, how we were going to be able to do that. And I found out that we needed to go to Superior Court, petition the court, and have that done. And during the time when the day came when we were ready to go to the courthouse to have that done, my father got cold feet. And I remember him saying, gosh, what did I do? Now that they know that we came into the country illegally, they're going to deport us. And so I didn't know quite what to say to him. We had to be there in about a half an hour. So I finally said to him, Dad, I wouldn't worry about it that much because number one, you haven't broken any other laws since then. You served in the Army. You had the same birthday as George Washington, February 22nd. He was very happy that he shared the same birthday with him. And then I said, the kicker of all was, they're not going to deport a taxpayer. Do you understand? So he said, oh, that's right. I pay my taxes and all. So we did go to court and we did have our name, changed back to Moy, which was really important for him. Next slide. And then, with the change in wash and wear, and also Bridgeport, when he bought the laundry, there was a lot of industry at the time. A lot of bachelors that didn't want to do their own laundry. So the laundry business was really good. But things had changed. So my mother and father, were forced to find second jobs besides keeping the laundry open. My mother found work as an assembly line worker, and my dad, worked as a custodian. It was interesting because he was a custodian at the high school that I went to, Bridgeport Central High School. December 1978, the city of Bridgeport bought both the laundry and his home for redevelopment. So he was finally forced to close the laundry that he owned for 30 years. They retired in 1982, and they became a loving papa and Ningin to our newly born granddaughters, Rebecca and Kristen. Next slide. And story continues. On to the left are my daughters, Kristen and Rebecca, and my granddaughter, Carla. My father gave both my daughters Chinese names. The names themselves don't translate as Kristen or Rebecca, but they're translations of Chinese phrases of his aspirations for his granddaughters. He named Rebecca Moy Bu Wun and Kristen Moy Ting Wun. And basically, it was a description of their hopes that as they became older and older, they would be, being the best version of themselves and achieving, greatness and all. And I named my granddaughter Moy Fu Yu, which basically is the same, desire for her. Rebecca and Carla, they live in Madrid, and Kristen lives in Denver. Next slide. And here they are now. The photos, you know, the big star in the family is the granddaughter, Carla. She's 23 months now, and pictures were taken last summer of Rebecca with Jaime, my daughter Kristen. That was last October. Even though they live in Madrid, they were very fortunate that they liked coming home. I think that's the thing they say about daughters: you never lose your daughters. Your sons, you'll hear from them, but the daughters always seem to be willing to be home. And here I am with Carla in my garden, you know, showing her my flowers. And you know, next slide. My father died in February of 2001. He contracted Lou Gehrig's disease, and for the last 5 years of his life, he was basically bedridden and really couldn't speak. It was a really sad way of seeing him go. And my dad really wasn't a man of many words. He basically taught by example. You know, just to give you an idea, one of the chores that I had to do working in the laundry with him was to actually separate the individual pieces of laundry. Shirts would go in one pile, dirty socks in another, underwear in another, uh, just so that we would be able to make sure there was a little laundry mark, which is my job to put on the clothing, article clothing, so that after it was all washed and ready, we could, you know, sort them out and make sure they got back into the same packages and all. So one day, my dad saw me. I think I was holding my nose or whatever. The smell is just terrible. And my dad said, "Well, do you like doing this?" And I said, "No, I really don't." And he said, "Well, if you don't, you know, take going to school and education seriously, this is what you're going to wind up doing the rest of your life." So that really struck in my mind how important it was for him to make sure that my sister and I, you know, took education seriously. Another incident that he taught me a lesson was, you know, when you grow up, there's a certain time when everyone wants to try, you know, how to smoke. You know, well, what does it taste like smoking? And one day my dad pulled me aside. We were outside. He says, "Here, I want you to smoke this cigarette." I said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes." So I did, and I started choking on it. And he says, "See what happens when you smoke? I don't want you to smoke anymore. Do you understand?" And, you know, I said, "I do." And besides teaching me that lesson, he himself gave up smoking. I can remember my dad smoking at least 2 packs a day. And these were at a time with unfiltered cigarettes and all. I think it was Camels or whatever. So again, he taught more by, you know, lessons than really by words and all. And, you know, I miss him. That's for sure. And then next slide, please. And let me see if I can read this. My pictures in a way. I don't think I can. Okay. I asked my father one day why he had come to the United States despite the prejudice and opportunities denied him because of his race. He was just as intelligent as his brothers, both civil engineers. His answer was to find a better life for himself and for his family. There was little bitterness in his response. Was the life he led an ordinary, inconsequential life? If social status, prestige, and wealth were the sole measures, then yes. He was simply a man who was hardworking, honest, generous, and fiercely loyal to family. But measuring it by those whose lives he influenced and made infinitely better, it was a life of consequence and meaning. His journey ended, but continues by those he left behind to carry on his legacy. Next slide. And here's a picture of my dad. Next slide. I bring us back to that original picture that I showed earlier. And to the right is a picture, a more up-to-date picture, probably taken in 1951 or 52 before my sister was born. The gentleman standing to the left is my grandfather. the man who started it all by calling my father and subsequently his other sons to the United States. The person to his right is my Uncle Harry, who is the younger boy in the right of the picture to your left. And sitting is my father and my mother and myself. Next picture. This is a family homestead. My uncle went back to China and was able to find his way back. It's deserted now. It did not have any plumbing or lighting at all. It has features of Chinese architecture, which is in the back and the front, the British influence of the columns and the arches and all. And the very first picture I remember seeing when I was growing up was a black and white photo of it. And everything around it was really rice paddies and all. The communists, when they took over the country, they basically took over ownership. No one has really lived in the home since. And I always felt that, well, somehow this house is just standing by itself, you know, out in the open somewhere where there's no one around. And if you could, Natalie, show the little video on the next slide. A relative shared this with me and basically wanted to show me what the village looks like now, to prove that, I guess, over the years, you know, more and more people, you know, have moved back. The buildings themselves, you know, more contemporary and all. But he'll slowly move over, and you'll actually will see the home, the family homestead, and he's again pointing out buildings to me. Not that I understand Chinese that much, but he's trying to tell me in Chinese what those particular buildings were. And you just, again, to give me an idea of what Canton, the village, looks like. And we're getting closer. Ah, there it is in the center. There's where the home is. It's still there. And all I thought was all along that it was just by itself deserted, but you can see that modern civilization now surrounds it. Okay. Next slide. You know, I think that Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month has really special urgency this year. 4 years after the pandemic, we've seen surges in anti-Asian hate. Asian Americans still feel targeted. In fact, in recent surveys, 1 in 3 report being the subject of hate, either called a racial or ethnic slur, or generally feeling threatened with violence. 61% of Asian Americans feel that hatred towards them has increased, and 41% feel that they'll likely will be a victim of physical attack in the next 5 years because of their race. And this is an interesting, you know, finding. 52% of Americans say they cannot name a famous Asian American. And when they do, the person who received the most votes was Jackie Chan. Unfortunately, he's not really American. He's really Chinese. He's not a Chinese American. And the other person was Bruce Lee, who happened to die more than 50 years ago. And the one name they did get correctly was Vice President Harris, and only 2% of people were able to name her as a famous Asian American. If I can just sort of, you know, put on my Civil War hat and my admiration for Abraham Lincoln for just a little bit, our country's really undergone 2 major revolutions. First one was our American Revolution, where George Washington, when we beat the British, we became a separate nation, the United States, the first experiment in democracy and all. Abraham Lincoln led us during our second American Revolution. in fighting the Civil War. And I think that Lincoln, when he expressed what the purpose of winning that war really meant, I think really still holds true. And in a address to Congress on July 4th in 1862, and I quote, "The Civil War is a people's contest to maintain in the world that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the condition of men, to lift artificial weights from all shoulders." And I think what he meant by artificial weights was like back then the slave laws and what I would consider exclusion laws that were, imposed upon the Chinese, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all and a fair chance in the race of life. Well, when Lincoln, in winning the Civil War, he eliminated the institution of slavery, provided citizenship with equal protection under the law, and the right to vote for 4 million slaves who are now freed and granted the same rights enjoyed by their former masters, and along with it, the upheaval of the social and economic structure of half the country. And I still believe that the Civil War is still the singular event in our nation's history. But more importantly, I think it helped define our national character to the rest of the world, as what Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address as being, quote, "a new birth of freedom," and his December 1st, 1862 address to Congress before he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, where he called the United States, quote, "the last hope of earth." And I just think that despite our present day political climate where immigration has become a divisive issue, especially talking about illegal immigrants, please remember that Chinese as a race was once illegal due to artificial weights or laws passed. The story of our nation is the story of immigrants, of people who face forms of oppression and long for a better life for ourselves and for their families, the very reasons our ancestors came. And I just hope that our elected officials will work together to come up with real weights for this issue, to reaffirm that our country's history is one and continues to be one of countless stories of known and unknown immigrants who lived, worked, and died, contributing to our historical tapestry and character. And I want to thank you for your interest and your time in allowing me to do this presentation.
Thank you so much for that. I'm gonna turn it over to anyone who has a question. I know we have a few comments in the chat. So Irving, you should know that you've been invited to visit the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania anytime by someone on the chat whose husband is the CEO over there. The same person, Laura, also put in the chat, she recommended a book about the importance of Mott Street in Chinatown called Mott Street, A Chinese American Family Story of Exclusion and Homecoming by Ava Chin. So I actually thought while we're waiting to see if any other questions go in the chat, I'd ask you, are there any books or sources that you recommend to listeners who might like to learn more about Chinese American history?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to give my email address. It's irvingmoy@yahoo.com. I'd be happy to send you a listing of two things, a listing of all the exclusion acts against Chinese, and also that you have a better understanding. The other information I'll send you is the National Park Service during the 150th anniversary of the Civil War came out with 3 books that talked about other Americans fighting for the cause of union, Native American Indians, Hispanics. And the one that I worked on with them was Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And that book is an excellent source, not only of the Chinese who fought in the Civil War, but a history of the Chinese coming to the United States, participating in its wars, and then the fight itself to become citizens in this country. And then it lists, the contributions that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, have made to this country. So I think those are two good sources that I'd be willing to send as an attachment if you're willing to send me your email. And again, it's irvingmoy@yahoo.com.
Okay, I just put that in the chat so people
Okay,
can see
thank
it
you.
written out. We have a question from Edward asking, in your research, have you come across what are the earliest known instances of Chinese people in the Americas?
Well, the earliest that I know, is when they came to Gold Mountain, when they all came for the gold rush. News of that spread throughout the world, and I'm sure the Chinese weren't the only ones who thought that they could come here and make a fortune for themselves to bring back to China and all. But again, in that Asian Pacific Honor book that the Park Service put out, it traces even more besides the Chinese, the Japanese who came when they came, also other Pacific Islanders. So I think that would be a very good resource. But I'm only aware of the Chinese who came first for the gold rush.
Okay. Your granddaughter Carla is in the chat and she says, "Great job, Papa."
No, she's been, every day we're fortunate. I could remember growing up, I think everyone does. When we had to make a call, when we were still using landlines, it would say, make sure Sunday you're at your phone at 8 o'clock because I'm going to make a call. And if you're not there, I'm going to have to pay for it. Well, now you can, call on Messenger or whatever. So it's a 6 hour difference. It's probably 7:04 now. So after I get off, I'm going to, make a little call just to say hello to Carla and Rebecca and Jaime and all. So, it's just wonderful that we're able to communicate the way that we have.
Well, that's lovely. Thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot. Your family story is, very interesting. And also, I think, so many aspects of it are universal to people who have,
Mhm.
who have especially recent immigrants in their family, right? Um, Before we go, I do just want to very quickly share with folks about some upcoming programs we have at the museum. So here we go. We actually have a very busy May at the Connecticut Museum. So coming up, we have two craft workshops that are happening. On this Saturday, we have an opportunity to learn some basic Persian calligraphy with Ali Baba Arang, who is a very distinguished calligrapher. And in a couple weeks on Saturday, May 18th, we have a beginner's printmaking workshop run by Felicia Stemples Cowdrey, who is on staff at the Connecticut Museum and an accomplished printmaker in her own right. So if you have a few hours and these are crafts you would like to be able to kind of join, learn about, even if, sort of worried about not knowing where to get started, these are excellent opportunities. And then on Thursday, May 16th, we have an event at the museum as well called Date Night, Making the Look. So our date night program is offered for couples of all types. You can bring a significant other, you can bring just a friend, you can bring more than one friend. You get an opportunity to play some to have some wine and some cheese and other snacks, and you get a behind the scenes tour of our collection. And that evening, the focus is on fashion accessories through the ages. So you get to see hats and shoes and shawls and jewelry and all kinds of things, fashion related, from our collection. And then you get to play a fun game about historic fashion. You don't have to know anything to play the game. It's just all for fun. So if you're interested in any of those programs, please do check out our website, connecticutmuseum.org, where you can register for all of these programs. And I'm going to stop sharing there. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending today.
Thank you.